CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie O.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Ukraine claims over 100 missiles have fallen across the country in another night of intense Russian bombardment.
Our other headlines: Belarus claims this Ukrainian missile has fallen on its territory. These pictures released by Minsk are from an undisclosed location.
China's rising COVID cases, but the European Union can't agree on how to screen passengers arriving.
And Benjamin Netanyahu makes his political comeback as Israel's Prime Minister. The country's most right-wing coalition ever is sworn in. Ukraine says over 100 missiles have hit targets across the country in the latest bombardment by Russia. This comes as fierce fighting continues in the city of Bakhmut, where Ukrainian and Russian forces are battling for control.
President Zelensky has urged his people to remain vigilant. Our correspondent Stephanie Fried reports from Bakhmut.
Intensified fighting here in Bakhmut continues for a second day running, where mortar and artillery fire is ongoing, almost without a let-up. This intensification has spread throughout the country, also strikes on major cities, including in Kyiv city center, also in the center of Kharkiv on Thursday morning, and that's following Russian strikes on Kherson for days running. Dozens of strikes, including the deadly Christmas Eve strike that resulted in at least 10 people killed there. Despite the Russian army's partial withdrawal from Kherson in November, because of these intensified strikes, Ukraine's officials are urging civilians to evacuate the city. Leading up to the new year, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky issued his annual address to the parliament. He was received with a standing ovation. He urged ongoing humanitarian efforts on the part of Ukrainians and issued a foreboding message to his citizens saying the year ahead will be tough.
Slava Ukraini!
Moving into the new year with that message, citizens of places like Bakhmut wonder how much more intense could it get. Stephanie Fried, CGTN, Bakhmut, Ukraine.
Well, this latest bombardment comes as Ukraine's top military chiefs warn that the conflict is approaching a deadlock, the capital city now under almost daily attack by Moscow-backed forces. Our correspondent Louise Greenwood reports.
Another morning in Ukraine's capital, and residents have awoken to scenes of devastation. In the biggest wave of airstrikes in weeks, civilian and infrastructure targets came under attack, leaving 3 people injured, including a 14-year-old girl. In the city's metro station, hundreds again took refuge as shells rained down.
Well, this morning was just crazy. To tell the truth, this is the kind of reaction when it's a sin to laugh.
Usually we are inside buildings, but as we were on call and almost there, we decided to go to the shelter.
We don't know how long the war will last. It's hard to be frightened every day and put your life on hold.
The city's mayor has advised residents to stock up on water supplies and to charge their phones and other appliances while power supplies are still running. This latest bombardment follows the Kremlin's rejection of a 10-point peace plan from Kyiv that insists on the full withdrawal of Russian troops in the country and an end to Moscow's claims on the eastern regions of the Donbass, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson.
We never reject proposals to reach diplomatic agreements, The conditions under which we are ready to start discussing these agreements are well known. An inalienable part of these conditions is the control of these 4 territories.
But as the new year approaches, Ukraine's top military chiefs are warning that the 10-month conflict is approaching a deadlock, with both sides as bitterly opposed as ever. In the port city of Odessa, once considered the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution, all links to the city's Russian imperial past are being removed, with the statue of Catherine the Great being dismantled by the authorities. Ukraine's leader has warned his people of a long road ahead, with President Zelensky telling Parliament that when the conflict finally does come to an end, the country's reconstruction will be Europe's largest economic project in modern times. Louise Greenwood, CGTN.
Jamie Shea is a former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary-General for Emerging Security Challenges. I asked him about the significance of the severity of Russia's latest attacks on Ukraine.
Putin is doubling down. He's clearly wants to exploit these winter months to maximum extent to inflict misery on the Ukrainians by taking out the electricity grid and the power generators. And so every time, of course, that Ukrainians, with a lot of finance from the United States and the European Union, manage to sort of repair them and get the electricity up and running again, another salvo of Russian missiles negates all of that good work, and we're back to 10-hour blackouts in Kiev or Lvov or Kharkiv. What Putin has done so far with these strikes is, of course, demonstrating that he can destroy 50–60% of Ukraine's electricity generation, but he hasn't yet succeeded in that other aim of making life so miserable for Ukrainians that in their millions they flee towards Poland and towards Western Europe, adding to the burden on the European Union from the refugee crisis. So far, the Ukrainians have shown remarkable resilience in sort of toughening it out, and it's going to be interesting to see if Putin, with these strikes, is able to provoke that humanitarian crisis. There are other factors as well, but let me stop at least there for now.
The majority of rockets, it's reported, have been shot down by Ukraine's air defence systems. How well do you think can the country shield itself from Russian missile attacks?
Well, I think, Jamie, that this is another factor why Putin is striking now, because he, first of all, knows that Ukrainians are getting very good at air defence. And as the United States and countries like France and other partners of Ukraine flow into Ukraine these more advanced air defence systems, you saw that President Biden was offering the US Patriot air defence system to President Zelensky when he visited Washington last week. The Ukrainians are going to have an even sturdier air defence and shoot down more of the Russian weapons. So from a Russian point of view, if you want, the maximum number of your drones and missiles to get through and hit their targets, strike now, because in 3 or 4 months' time, the Ukrainians, who also, by the way, have announced that they're developing new air-to-air drone capabilities as well by themselves. In 6 months' time, then the number of Russian missiles, at least the interception rate, will go from, say, 60%, what it is at the moment, to 90%, and the Russians will be wasting a lot of their force.
The head of Ukraine's military intelligence is suggesting that fighting is now deadlocked. Is that your analysis?
No, not exactly. But we clearly see these operations in the Donetsk area around the city town of Bakhmut going on. The Russians, even at great cost to themselves in terms of manpower and equipment losses, clearly see this as a symbolic gain. If they could take Bakhmut, they would inflict a kind of morale blow on the Ukrainians, who have been, of course, enjoying a lot of success recently, for example, regaining Kherson, and they would put themselves in a strong position in the spring when they have all of their reserve call-up conscript forces and the renewal of their equipment, strengthening their battalions. They would put themselves in a good position then to resume their advance and to try to recapture all of the territory of the 4 provinces that they claim to have annexed. So the fighting does go on, and the ability to not allow the Russians to take Bakhmut so that Ukrainians keep the initiative is going to be very, very important. The key question is, who is going to use these winter months to recover and re-equip best Ukraine or Russia to be in the best position to strike further. The Ukrainians, of course, to liberate their territory. The Russians, as I've said, to seize fully the territory of their 4 provinces when spring arrives and military operations become possible again.
Well, as we've been reporting, a fresh wave of Russian missiles have reportedly hit several major Ukrainian cities. Let's talk to our correspondent Stuart Smith, who's in Moscow. So, Stuart, Russia appears to be increasing its mortar and artillery attacks on Ukraine. What's Moscow saying about it?
Yeah, you wouldn't know it from here in Russia. The Russian media, which of course works under very strict conditions right now, has been left only reporting on the consequences of explosions, of power cuts and transport disruption, because right now the Russian Ministry of Defense hasn't confirmed that it was responsible for the latest round of attacks. The only hint that it has offered to suggest it has anything to do with it was a poster put on its Telegram channel in Russian saying that its caliber missiles will not run out. That comes on the same time as this Belarusian Ministry of Defense reports it shot down a Ukrainian air defense missile, which Ukraine has now all but admitted to being responsible for. Now, earlier, the regional official in the region where this missile fell suggested it was no big deal. He was saying that unfortunately these things do happen and that there were no significant casualties. Subsequently, the Belarusian Foreign Ministry has said this is an extremely serious incident. It's called the Ukrainian ambassador to Minsk to provide answers. It says it must not happen again and suggested that this was something that Ukraine needs to look into, to conduct an investigation and hold those that allowed it to happen to be held responsible. So Belarus at the official level taking this more seriously than before. But indeed, no casualties were hurt by the air defense system, which was most likely being used to repel these Russian missiles. As to what Russia's experiencing right now, 2 regions on the border with Ukraine, as they so often are, either experiencing shelling and anti-air defense systems being fired up again to take down Ukrainian armaments, and also a region far deeper into Russia experiencing some activity, this time the Saratov region, where windows were broken and damage was caused to cars as Russian air defense systems lit up the sky to try to shoot down a Ukrainian drone, according to the regional governor.
And Stuart, Russia's currency, the ruble, is now at an 8-month low. Is that because of the latest oil and gas sanctions?
Yeah, that's right. It's only got worse throughout the day, and indeed it is almost completely to do with that. It's a mixture now of increasing imports as Russia finds ways around sanctions, but also now lower export revenue with that oil price cap in place and Russian exports of oil plummeting significantly in December. It's also interesting because normally the ruble gets stronger at the end of the month, and that hasn't happened this year. So it'll be interesting to see how much more it weakens when we get to the beginning of the month, when traditionally the ruble's weaker anyway.
Stuart, thank you very much. Our correspondent, Stuart Smith in Moscow.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, we're on Wall Street next as the markets respond to the latest US unemployment figures.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and the bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Global Business Europe. US stocks have jumped as investors gear up for the final trading day of the year.
The bounce comes despite an unexpected rise in unemployment. Our correspondent John Terrett is in New York. John, the weekly jobs data is ticking upwards, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I tell you something, we get this figure every single week, and a lot of times we ignore it, but we're getting to the stage now where it's becoming more and more important. Let me try to tell you why. This is the number of people signing up for first-time unemployment benefit. That is to say, benefits that they get at the state level, not the federal level, but at the state level, for about 13 weeks. Now, during the COVID period, they got them for a lot longer, but now it's back to about 13 weeks. Hopefully, in that time, they'll get another job. And this means that these people did not have a very happy Christmas because the figure was taken up to last Saturday, the 24th of December. 9,000 extra this month over, rather this week over the previous week, and bringing the total to 225,000, which is going in the right direction. It sounds a lot. But actually, the truth is that before COVID, we had this figure on a weekly basis. It was much higher, closer to around 300,000. So what is going on? Well, the answer is the Federal Reserve is trying desperately to calm this 40-year inflation down by rising interest rates. They've had 7 of them in 2022. 4 of them were jumbo size of 75 basis points. Some people are accusing the Federal Reserve of trying to create a recession in 2023 in order to really bring down inflation super quickly. But the problem is, despite all these interest rate hikes, the labor sector still remains strong, as I think these figures illustrate. So remember, they're going in the right direction. They're going up, which is what the authorities here want, unbelievably. But they're not going up really as much as they thought they would. And retail sales are slowing, but not as much as people thought that they would. Look at the spending that was done over Christmas. It was up about 10% in online and about 7% in stores. Now, the problem we have here at the stock exchange, remember the stock exchange is not the economy, they are 2 separate things. But the problem we have here is that these people are reacting to good news and bad news. So the good news comes in and they think, oh my goodness me, this means more interest rate hikes in 2023. And then the bad news comes in and they think, oh my goodness me, that means a definite recession in 2023, which is why the markets have been going down. Now, today, I can't really read this. I'm just going to tell you what's happening here. The Dow is up 1%. The Nasdaq is ahead by 2.4%, and the S&P 500 by 1.6%. But for the year, the Dow is down 10%, the Nasdaq 35%, and the S&P 500 is down by 1%. So it's been a pretty grim year one way or another. I think these people here just want to get this year out of the way. You know, enough already. Let's pick up on Monday, they say, and see what we can do after the year has turned. Among the companies that have done very well this year, the energy sector, Occidental, Hess, Constellation, and Exxon Oil. And the losers have been Tesla, which you can probably imagine, Match.com, which owns Tinder, Meta Platforms because of all the shenanigans with the metaverse, and PayPal, the pay company that was in part, in its early days, started by Elon Musk.
I'll talk to you about the Exxon story in just a few moments in detail, but I just want to ask you about the US demanding COVID tests for visitors from China. What do you sense the reaction is there?
Bit of a Debbie Downer, if I'm honest with you, quite frankly. I've spent the last 2 days telling you how everybody here was rather pleased that China appears to be opening up again after 2 years, and indeed they are. And the Chinese stocks that trade on Wall Street have had a terrific December. They're up between about 10 and 30%, depending. And Wall Street's happy because it means they can get their executives back into China now to meet face-to-face the people they haven't been able to see for about the last 2 years. However, yesterday the U.S. administration comes out and says, actually, anybody coming in from China after January the 8th will need a negative COVID test. Now, what's interesting about this is that Biden called President Trump a xenophobe when he did this, when he was in power, and now President Biden has done it for this rather puncturing the good news balloon that China has been enjoying for the last couple of days. So there was like an exhaling of air when this news came out late yesterday. It speaks to the tension that there still is, I think, between DC and Beijing behind the scenes over various issues. India, of course, is doing this as well. So too is Japan. The question here is, was it really necessary? Because if you have a COVID test, say, on the Thursday before you fly, by the time you get to us here, on the Saturday, you could have picked up COVID even if your test was actually negative. And all the variants that they have in China, we have them here in America as well. So a lot of people wonder whether it was really all that necessary. And the problem is, from China's perspective, that it always sparks off hours and hours of anti-Chinese coverage on cable news and in the newspapers here, which, you know, it makes China look bad. It makes China look at fault, when in fact 2 days ago people were celebrating what they'd done.
Can we talk about this Exxon story, because that's going to cause concern in Europe? This huge energy giant, Exxon, suing the EU over its windfall tax.
I know, this is a very interesting story, Jamie and Robin, and you've got to remember the Exxon shares are up by 77% in the last year. I mean, I told you just now that the energy sector had done particularly well, and I named some of the companies, including Exxon. Well, Exxon's shares up 77%. It's extraordinary, really. This is the second year in a row that energy has been the winning sector here. Now, the issue is that Exxon, in its third quarter, its earnings were $20 billion. And the EU is looking at that and saying, well, look, you know, you only made that money because of Ukraine and because of the rising commodity prices around the world prompted by what's happening in Ukraine and also by rising inflation. So we're going to slap a windfall tax on you that will, if it all goes well for us, raise $25 billion for the Eurozone countries. Well, Exxon is saying, well, hold on a second, just whoa, slow down there, because actually we think you are exceeding your powers over there in Brussels. And my understanding is that the Dutch and the German divisions of Exxon have filed papers in Luxembourg today, basically suing the EU over this windfall tax. Exxon says, look, you're exceeding your authority, it's counterproductive, it'll discourage investment, it'll undermine investor confidence in us. And by the way, we might actually just have to factor this in the next time we think about a multi-million-dollar investment in the Eurozone. So you might like to bear that in mind. Now, President Biden, would he love to do this? Oh, boy, would he love to do this. He can't. He keeps threatening it here, but he can't do it, mainly because his administration, the time is running out for him now. Campaigning for the next presidential election will essentially begin in January of 2023, in a couple of weeks' time. And also, this is much more of a petrochemical society here, and it involves the stock market and that 77% increase in the Exxon stock price. So it's much more difficult for him to do it. But anyway, Exxon's going after the European Union. We'll see what happens.
John, it'll run and run. Good to see you. Our correspondent John Terrace in New York.
European natural gas prices are back at levels last seen before the war in Ukraine. It's now trading at a quarter of the peak seen in August. Since then, unseasonably warm weather in much of Europe has reduced demand for heating and allowed the continent to replenish gas. Last week, the EU agreed on a temporary mechanism to limit excessive gas prices from February.
This striking footage shows the impact of the powerful winter storm that hit North America over Christmas. Those frozen houses in Canada's Ontario province, which directly face Lake Erie, took the brunt. At least 65 people known to have died in the extreme weather, half of them in the US state of New York.
The boss of Goldman Sachs has told staff he plans to cut jobs next month. The US investment bank is reportedly preparing to act around 4,000 posts. The bank is seeking to improve profits amid concerns over the global economy.
Kosovo has reopened its border with Serbia after ethnic Serbs agreed to remove barricades which have blocked roads for as many as 19 days. This comes after they met Serbia's president, who says the United States and the EU have guaranteed that no protesters involved will be prosecuted. Tension escalated after the arrest of an ethnic Serb police officer.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. China COVID cases surge, but how are countries around the world reacting?
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference? The difference is in the detail, in the background,
defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Ukraine claims over 100 missiles have fallen across the country in another night of intense Russian bombardment.
Our other headlines, Belarus claims this Ukrainian missile has fallen on its territory. These pictures released by Minsk are from an undisclosed location. Well, China continues to see a rise in coronavirus cases. However, both domestic and international control measures continue to be relaxed. Our correspondent Dai Kai reports now from Beijing.
It's about 4 days since China stopped publishing its daily case count, and the country continues to optimize, as you said, its COVID restriction and control measures. For example, lifted many of the restrictions in terms of international arrivals. They're about to take effect starting from January 8th, which is next Sunday. For example, it removed the 75% inbound flights occupancy limit, and international travelers can enter China without having to be put under mandatory quarantine, and they don't have to go through mass testing upon arrival. Of course, they're still advised to take PCR tests 48 hours before their departure for China, and those who test positive are likely to be asked to reschedule, meaning they have to postpone their flights, their travels to China until they test negative. But the overall trend here, the overall signal that China is trying to send is that the country is opening up to the rest of the world, and it's scrapping restrictions in terms of international flights and increasing the number of flights in stages. And domestically, I have to mention that China's Lunar New Year holiday is nearing, and the China's health authorities said the country's rural areas population is particularly vulnerable to the spread of COVID, and that means some of the preparations need to be done. And indeed, they are underway, as Chinese authorities said that clinics and hospitals in townships, counties, as well as villages, they will have enough and sufficient medicines in store, because that's one of the key tasks there. That's to have medications and having medications be effectively distributed to the patients there. And also it's essential for people for those critically ill patients to be transferred in a timely manner to hospitals that are capable of treating them and curing them. But generally speaking, Chinese health authorities say the country's medical resources, as well as the country's ICU beds resources especially, are remaining to be sufficient.
Well, the United States is the latest country to announce mandatory COVID testing for passengers arriving from China after Beijing lifted travel restrictions. The United States joins India and Japan, but the UK, France and Australia say that so far they have no plans to follow. One European country that has brought in stricter measures, though, is Italy. Our correspondent Alex Fraser is in Milan for us. So, Alex, Italy taking one path, but the EU overall hasn't come to a decision on what to do with arriving Chinese passengers.
Yes, no decision yet from the EU as a whole. The EU's Health and Security Committee met today. They basically said that there needed to be any action that was taken needed to be coordinated by EU member states. And the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control have said today that screening Chinese passengers at the moment is unjustified. Well, whether that policy is unjustified or not, Italy decided to implement it yesterday. Passengers arriving here at the airport behind me, Milan Malpensa, passengers arriving from China are being tested for COVID. And earlier today, Giorgia Meloni, Italy's Prime Minister, had her end-of-year press conference. She said that the EU needed to follow Italy's lead and to act unilaterally on this one because she says that due to the Schengen system, if only one member state tests and the others don't, that wouldn't stop new variants. So at the moment, there doesn't seem to be complete unity across the EU on it. At the moment, Germany and France have said that they won't take any action as of yet. Great Britain also said the same, but as of later today, we've heard comments from the Defence Minister, who has said that they will be reviewing the situation.
So, Alex, it's been reported that half of all passengers coming from China arriving on 2 flights at Milan Airport, where you are, it's reported that they tested positive for COVID. What more can you tell us?
So regional officials have said in the last few days that they conducted 212 tests on passengers arriving from China on Boxing Day on the 26th of December, and they had 97 positive cases, and those people will quarantine in buildings in Milan. These tests are all about sequencing and finding potential other variants. Italy was heavily affected by the first wave of COVID and understandably is worried about any sort of new variants that might evade a vaccine. So that's why they're testing so heavily. I mean, we've already had another 3 flights arrive today from China at Malpensa. And it's worth noting that Italy hadn't changed restrictions or implemented any new ones since the 1st of June. Passengers have been able to arrive here without a green pass, or without taking a test. So it'll be interesting to see in the coming days how the rest of the European capitals react and if they'll follow the same sort of testing system that Italy looks like it's going to be implementing.
Alex, thank you very much. Our correspondent Alex Fraser in Milan. Well, Paul Hunter is a professor in medicine at the University of East Anglia. I asked him whether he expects to see a coordinated approach on border policy.
We never saw a coordinated approach across the EU at any time, really, during COVID, so I'd be surprised if it starts now. And I think that the issue about whether or not screening of infectious diseases at points of entry into country have any value is quite open to debate. There was a big review of all the evidence in 2019, which concluded that such screening for infectious diseases was actually ineffective. And since COVID, there's nothing's changed to that conclusion. There's been papers that looked at the value of screening at points of entries and basically not really being able to show that it had much value in controlling the international spread of infectious diseases.
So you think that screening doesn't have much of a role to play? What about travel restrictions? Can they help stop the spread of diseases like COVID?
They can, but only for a certain while. And what we saw at the beginning of COVID was that although the pandemic started in China, for the UK, most of our early infections came from France, Spain or Italy. And so if you're going to close your borders, and closing your borders can actually delay infections like New Zealand did, but they closed their borders to pretty much every country. If you just did that for China, then what about people coming from other surrounding countries or intermediate countries that were still open to China? You know, this spread is inevitable. But what we're seeing in China at the moment is that most of the infections are variants that actually have been present in Europe for many months. And you know, one of them particularly, the BF.7, that is probably responsible for about half of the variants in China, actually peaked in the UK back in September, October time, and has been in decline because other variants from elsewhere in the world have sort of outcompeting it.
So do you think that lessons have been learned from the early days of the pandemic when it comes to trying to stop the spread?
Yes, but I think one of the problems here is that it depends who you talk to about what those lessons were, and I don't think there's any. Often there is no real consensus amongst different scientists about what works and what doesn't, and that's a problem. You can always easily find people to disagree on COVID, but getting people to agree is not quite so easy.
Israel's new government has been sworn in, with Benjamin Netanyahu returning as Prime Minister in what's considered to be the country's most right-wing coalition ever. Netanyahu begins a record sixth term as leader amid fears that his policies, particularly the expansion of Jewish settlements, could cause domestic and regional turmoil and alienate some of Israel's closest allies. He says he's focused on other matters.
The first is to thwart Iran's efforts to develop a nuclear bombs arsenal which will threaten us and the entire world. Second, we will guarantee Israel's military advantage in the region by unceasing empowerment. The third mission is to continue expanding the circle of peace with Arab states in order to end the Israeli-Arab conflict.
Now, it's a dark chapter of the UK's Second World War history, a story of racial prejudice that resulted in broken families, lost heritage, and a campaign to make British authorities apologise.
Thousands of Chinese seamen now serving with the Allied Merchant Navy, bringing food to Britain, munitions from America.
Chinese sailors based in Liverpool served alongside Allied soldiers and were forcibly repatriated when the Second World War ended. Hundreds of men vanished overnight, leaving behind their wives and their children without any explanation of where they'd gone. I've been talking to some of those families in the CGTN documentary, The Secret Betrayal.
What do you say to the people who might say this was all a very long time ago, you should simply just move on?
It might have been a long time ago, so there's been an injustice for a long time, and it's about time that people stood up and put it right.
What would they do if it was their father? You'd want to know. I don't care who you are. I feel as if no matter what, you'd want to know, if you could. You know, and they've been hiding it all these years.
A lot of people will say, look, the landscape in which these events unfolded was the chaos of a world war.
They could just apologise, though, couldn't they? You know, to actually make people feel better. They could have just said, we're really sorry what happened. There's nobody alive who made those decisions. But we're still treating people who've worked for Britain like dirt and disregarding their entire lifetime spent in Britain and any family that they've built up. So I don't have any expectations that the government's going to do anything, really, except make a few noises. Like I say, they've not even apologised. That'd be a start.
And you can watch the full documentary by going to cgtn.com/The Secret Betrayal.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead.
Liftoff of the Falcon 9 and DART.
The out-of-this-world stories that made 2022 an exciting year for science.
I fell in love with Chinese culture the second I started to experience it.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the icebreakers.
Building bridges is a natural thing. There is no age and gender difference in our spirit, no race difference in our soul.
I think food is an incredible way of bringing different cultures together. I am enjoying learning every aspect about it.
Chinese literature stretches back from millennia, but it's still really relevant for today.
I hope that Chinese and British fashion community could be more frequently communicating with each other.
An incredible mix of people, cultures, food, and there is so much to see and so much to do.
I have a great desire to make the Chinese civilization more accessible.
It's about our future generation's future.
The craftsmanship, the technique, the material uses, the color uses.
You can kind of take things on board and continue to develop and grow.
Meet the bridge builders, the individuals who dare to think beyond the horizon and open up our world.
Everything seems to have a story. I just think that's absolutely beautiful. A huge tick.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Spain has seen its worst year on record for wildfires.
Extreme heat and drought across Europe sparked forest and brush fires in France, Greece and the United Kingdom. Our correspondent Ken Brown reports.
2022 was the hottest year in over a century in Spain and led to deadly consequences. Wildfires wreaked havoc across the country. Over 300,000 hectares were burned. That's more than ever before. The widespread flames brought danger into people's daily lives, like the panicked train passengers who broke windows to escape an out-of-control fire in Valencia. Experts believe that climate change is exacerbating the problem.
It's clearly a major factor. The drought produces a lack of hydration in the vegetation, so the fires spread faster. The fact that the temperatures continue to rise also means more evaporation, and it becomes like a continuous loop. The droughts are more intense and the fires are more violent.
Scenes like this, with vast swaths of land reduced to ash, became a familiar sight across Spain this summer. And the longer-term picture is worrying. Temperatures are rising twice as fast in Europe as they are in the rest of the world, and experts believe that this will lead to more frequent droughts and ever more destructive wildfires. In October, we also saw forestry workers and firefighters go on strike. They said they were overworked, underpaid, and that the job simply wasn't worth the risk anymore. Now there is growing concern over what's coming next in 2023.
The truth is we're worried because 2022 was tough, and so much depends on this changing climate. Small shifts have big effects when it comes to wildfires, and we're not expecting those changes to work in our favor. We're bracing for another difficult year. It could be even worse.
Thousands of people were evacuated from their homes across Spain this summer as temperatures well above 40 degrees centigrade or 104 Fahrenheit swept across southern Europe in a relentless series of heat waves. According to World Health Organization estimates, almost 2,000 people died due to the heat waves across Spain and Portugal this year. Now, firefighters and forestry workers are busy putting preventative measures in place before the next wildfire season begins. Here on the front lines of the climate crisis, it's clearer than ever that big changes are needed, and needed soon. Ken Brown, CGTN, Guadalajara.
The United States is ending 2022 with a crisis on its border with Mexico, as a pandemic-era policy which allows officials to immediately expel migrants could expire in the coming months.
The US Supreme Court has ruled that the measure known as Title 42 can remain in place temporarily while legal arguments play out. But amid all the uncertainty, there's been a huge increase in border crossings. Our correspondent Tony Waterman reports.
In the final weeks of 2022, thousands of migrants have streamed across the U.S. southern border. Many have spent weeks walking hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers, and often through dangerous territory as they seek out a better life in America.
It has been a very hard trip. Everything gets stolen on the way. We go hungry. Everything.
There were a record 2.7 million migrant encounters in the 2022 fiscal year, easily breaking the previous record set in 2021.
I think it's become a permanent crisis.
Immigration expert Tony Payen isn't hopeful that Democrats and Republicans will find a solution anytime soon. But he does think working with the Mexican government will be key to managing the crisis.
There's just too many individuals to process, and there's only so much physical capacity, institutional capacity to deal with these immigrants. So Title 42 without an agreement with Mexico would be chaotic. Title 42 with a clear agreement with Mexico is sufficient to manage the flows.
Also unresolved at the close of 2022, the fate of so-called dreamers who were brought to the U.S. illegally as children. An end-of-year push to give them citizenship has fizzled, and their status continues to be challenged even after a federal appeals court ruled that the DACA program, which protects dreamers from deportation, is unlawful.
Maybe it'll ruin our futures. I don't know, and it's really hard to live life that way.
Political theater around immigration also hit new heights this year, with some Republican governors shelling out millions of dollars to bus migrants north in an effort to pressure Democrats and U.S. President Joe Biden to clamp down on immigration policy. Texas was the first to start this trend. It's now bused more than 13,000 migrants to cities like Washington, D.C., Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York City, often without prior notice. The lack of coordination and the influx of migrants have forced some mayors to declare a state of emergency and has raised questions about human trafficking. Critics say the Biden administration hasn't done enough to address the immigration challenges facing the country, focusing on the fact that neither the president nor the vice president visited the border this year to assess the problems firsthand.
Is it going to make a difference if Kamala Harris or even the president himself show up at the border? Not really. I mean, what are they going to do? They show up, they take it's a photo op, and then they move on. But the immigrants keep coming. What they need is a good, solid policy, a protocol, rules in place.
Something that hasn't happened in 2022 and could be a pipe dream in 2023 as well. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Austin, Texas.
Well, this has been a momentous year when it comes to developments in science. I've been talking to Emma Keeling from our science and technology show Razor about which stories stood out for her.
I want to thank you for making me having to think so hard at the end of the year. I don't like to think at this time of year, and you've made me think about these incredible stories we've had in science. So the first one I wanted to cover was space. And I don't know if you remember back in September, the DART mission, NASA's DART mission, and they were basically firing a rocket at an asteroid 11 million kilometres away to try and shove it off its orbit. And the reason they wanted to do this was, well, you may remember dinosaur times. I know you're not that old, but you remember back, and the asteroid, and they wiped them all out. So NASA are going, okay, what if this happens again? It's a bit like the movies, really, isn't it? What happens? What can we do? So this was a test to see if they could give it a bump off its orbit, and they did. Dimorphos got bumped a lot further than they thought. It's actually slowed it down by about 32 minutes on its orbit around Didymos. So a huge success, and you remember all the crowds there applauding, and why not? Because, well, this is Earth defence we're talking about. So, I mean, this is big picture stuff. We're not threatened at the moment, but it's good to know that they've done this test just in case.
And it's almost like science fiction, isn't it? If we look at the pictures behind you, we can see that the second story that caught your eye is also to do with space. What is it?
So this is about the Chinese space program, and boy have they been busy. So over the last few years they've done things like they've put a rover on Mars, they've brought back lunar samples from the moon. They are planning to build a science lab on the moon as well. The other one is this, Tiangong. So this is the new space station, and it is now operational. It will be fully occupied for the next 10 years at least, and they'll be doing thousands of science experiments, bringing in people from all different countries, bringing people on board as well from different countries to do these tests. And so really exciting. They're also talking about possibly even having tourists on board. I don't know how you feel about maybe you and I. Are you busy next year? Popping up?
Always got time to go to space. You know what, when I was small I wanted to be an astronaut, so I would absolutely be really keen to do that.
Ah, well I don't want to go, so you can take my spot. I can barely cope on Earth, so yeah, I'll leave that one to you.
And obviously a huge year in space then. What do you foresee happening next year in 2023? What will the big stories be in science and technology?
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about space stories was I wanted to give us perspective about what I'm now going to talk about, which is climate change, which is biodiversity. We've had COP27, we've had COP15, and you know, astronauts often talk about the first time they go to space and they look back at Earth and they go, wow, how precious is what we have, because out there is nothing like us. And so it's just really sort of, I guess it's honing in on the fact that these discussions will be ongoing for many, many years. We have so many things to solve and sort out. The consequences of our behaviour needs to be rectified. And so it's really about telling everybody that, I mean, I know it's overwhelming. I don't know how overwhelming you feel. You're doing the news all the time and all these climate change stories. I mean, you know, here we've got the Pakistan floods, which were so devastating.
Yeah, I mean, always a concern.
So I think it's sort of saying, okay, yes, we've got lots to do. We're making progress. Things are changing. We've got the loss and damage fund that's about to start up. But yeah, there's just always so much more to do. And it does feel overwhelming when you watch the news. But as we've seen on Razor this year with so many different stories that we've done, people aren't waiting for politicians and officials to do something. They're getting up and doing it themselves. And they understand that to save ourselves, we have to save our environment first.
Dubai's international airport has issued an alert for passengers travelling between now and the 3rd of January. It's expecting nearly 2 million people, making it one of the busiest periods since 2019. Our correspondent Naweed Jabarkil has been talking to the CEO of Dubai Airports about how the region's hoping for a boom in tourism to help it bounce back from the pandemic.
Well, we're something around 68 million at the moment, projected for the year. We keep revising our forecast in the upward direction. The peak time pre-pandemic, that was about 7.8 million. We're pretty confident that we're actually going to see those numbers continue to increase progressively, and hopefully before the end of next year, or if not, then certainly by the middle to end of 24, we expect to be right back where we were pre-pandemic, if not even stronger.
And the resurgence at Dubai airports, without one country in particular in recent years, China, just how important has that market been? The last time we spoke, obviously, new routes were being opened up. Dubai tourism, from a Chinese perspective, was booming. How's it looking now and moving forward?
Well, the Chinese market's incredibly important, and as you know, the growth of Chinese visitors to Dubai has been immense over the pre-pandemic years, but now obviously with the struggles to cope with the recovery post-COVID, we do miss those passengers, and we hope they're going to come back very quickly.
And looking at Saudi Arabia, a new airport announced here, 6 runways, 57 square kilometres, 120 million passengers by 2030. That sort of competition on your doorstep can't be good for business.
Well, actually, if you think about it, the Middle East has been a sort of slight grey area for tourism for so many decades. And when you look at some of the treasures that have remained hidden for hundreds of years, opening up whole countries like Saudi Arabia to tourism, I think will be an enormous opportunity to broaden the mind and get people to treat the Middle East as a really interesting area for travel and tourism. And just like the development of travel and tourism in Europe, American and Japanese tourists, when they come to Europe, they do not want to go to one single location. They want to come to London, to Paris, to Rome, to Madrid. I think the Middle East will be exactly the same, and actually having more destinations on the map with developments in Saudi, with all the additional airport capacity, will actually be good for all of the GCC countries and everyone in the region. So I think it's going to be a good thing.
And do you think there's actually enough demand for that? Do you see those sorts of numbers being met? You have ambitious targets, Saudi Arabia announcing ambitious targets. With Doha, there appears to be a bit of a rivalry between Emirates and Qatar Airways. Is there going to be enough of a pie to go around?
Well, I think so, because remember, we're not just serving the region, but we are connecting thousands of city pairs originating from all over the world to the rest of the world. So actually, it's a pretty big pie. And of course, what we've seen is projections for travel far outstripping GDP growth, possibly double over the next few years. So if that demand continues to be strong, the supply at the moment is a little bit constrained, but over the longer term, I think more people will want to travel to more places. And if there's the capacity in the Middle East to make them come through the hubs in the Middle East, because obviously it's very difficult to build that capacity in other parts of the world, I think those ambitious targets will be met.
The headlines again. Ukraine claims over 100 missiles have fallen across the country in another night of intense Russian bombardment.
Belarus claims that a Ukrainian missile has fallen on its territory. These pictures released by Minsk are from an undisclosed location.
And Benjamin Netanyahu makes his political comeback as Israel's Prime Minister. The country's most right-wing coalition ever is sworn in.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Preview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow. Same time, same place. From all of the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.